Namaste everyone. Welcome to this two-day online seminar on a comprehensive approach towards research methodology. So today is the second day. So we'll start with the Mangala Charana. Om Shuklam Bharadharam Vishnu Shashavarnam Chaturbhajam Prasannavadanam Dhyayet Sarva Vighnopashantaye Ajnanatimiraandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitanjena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So this seminar is being conducted by Siddhanta Knowledge Foundation in association with IKSHA, which is Indic Knowledge Systems and Heritage Association, and IKS Division, Ministry of Education. So before we start, I just wanted to give a small introduction about SKF, which we missed yesterday. So Siddhanta Knowledge Foundation is part of Siddhanta Group, founded under the leadership of Shri Jaikishan Jhaverji. SKF has taken up the ambitious goal of making Bharatiya Jnana Parampara accessible and actionable for Bharat's current and future generations and revive their pride and confidence in their heritage. Siddhanta Knowledge Foundation strongly believes in empowering Shastra scholars with technology, tools to research, extract and curate content from Shastras, and build content for mainstream education and real-world applications. In addition to working as a preferred IKS knowledge partner to IKS Division, Ministry of Education, Government of India, SKF is also a designated IKS Shikshaka Prasikshana Kendra. SKF is convinced that this seminar of research methodology is a first yet critical step towards uncovering the hidden power of Bharatiya Gaveshana. So today, first we are going to have a lecture by Shri M.S. Chaitra ji, who is the director for Center for Studies of Cultures and Associate Professor of Practice in Chanakya University. So Shri M.S. Chaitra, an associate professor at Chanakya University, specializes in reconceptualizing Indian intellectual traditions, aiming to access and reconstruct their profound understanding of the experiential world. His work involves comparing Western and Indian cultures through the lens of the comparative science and of cultures framework. Initially trained as a biologist with expertise in molecular genetics, ecology, and evolutionary biology, he transitioned towards social sciences after working with institutions like the Wildlife Institute of India and the Indian Institute of Science. Chaitraji is also a founder of the Arohi Research Foundation and has served as a senior fellow at the India Studies Unit at CESS Bengaluru. Mahodaya, I request you to kindly deliver your lecture.
Namaskara, everyone. Very good afternoon. So I have a difficult task of carrying the foundation laid yesterday. Take it. It is really a difficult task because yesterday there was high-level pitching that was really done. So just to recapitulate what happened yesterday. Now, Varkhediji began with a very significant question, saying, if we want to talk about research in Indian languages and Sanskrit tradition, what do we refer to? What does it correspond to? Because we need to have some reference on how do we talk about this issue. And then subsequently, Nagaraj Pathuriji took the question, which is very prominent discussion within the social scientific research about the cultural bias and how do we really look at it. Sampaji took it to one level further by making it, the debate on objectivity, subjectivity, and he made an attempt to do an inward looking by focusing on Indian traditions. And Ramanoharji, as usual, taking the experience of Ayurveda, profoundly looked at pariksha as a very important notion to think about how Ayurveda system functions, etc. Now, the question would be that when we talk about social sciences, why should we talk about, Indian methods to look at society and culture? Now, unlike, for example, when we discuss about physics, chemistry, biology, etc., where we don't get into these kind of debates, but why do we really get into this kind of debate when it comes to the question of literature, question of society, question of anthropology becomes a very significant question. Now, most of us know, for example, we don't intend to oppose something because it is Western. I mean, it is not in the nature of Indian traditions or Indian culture that we oppose something because it is something not made within India. I mean, we are very happy to get benefited by science and technology which came from Europe, and we had absolutely no problem with that. So why is that we have been having serious problem with the Western methods, Western theories, Western social sciences, etc. As opposed to that, we have to build an alternative from Indian version, etc. Why is this conversation relevant today? Is a basis on which we need to think about. And what I would like to do today is that now there is one way that, as student of social sciences, one way of exploring societies and culture is something that we have been trained to do. And there are also other ways in which Indians have looked at it. So there are different ways of seeing the world. In Indian tradition, seeing is a very important thing. Darshana, Iksha. This is a very important issue, that how do we see? And what would be a meaningful way of knowing? So in my talk, what I would be interested in doing is not to really say which one is superior, which one is inferior, but rather I would want to convert this conversation into a question: which way of seeing is a better way of finding a meaningful understanding of the lives of people and making sense of what happens around us? That is the concern. And my claim is that Indian traditions have something significant to offer to see the very existence of human being, the nature of human being, etc., than the way the lot of social scientific theories would actually give it, present it in front of us. In order to make this journey, let me sort of reconnect with some of the very important discussion about social sciences, which was already raised in the yesterday's conversation. The conversation point is this: that whenever there is an engagement that is being done in social sciences and humanities, when these methods have been used to talk about Indian culture, we find it very uncomfortable to take the conclusions of this research. And it sort of distorts us. Either it romanticizes us, or it sort of denigrates us. It reduces us to a subhuman condition. It projects Indian people into some kind of immoral, not thoughtful, irrational, all these kind of people. And this seemed to be a growing kind of discomfort with the very nature of the presentation that is done through social sciences. So there are different approaches that people have taken. But let's ask a central question. When we say we are uncomfortable with the conclusion of social scientific research, what are we uncomfortable with? Now, one of the most significant point that we can say is that if you take social scientific research seriously, and if you read its conclusion, whether it is about our ritual, whether it is about the kind of groups, whether it is Jati, Kula, Gotra, whatever we have, or whether it is our food habit, whether it is our psychology or anything else that you see, the way we are described as living people in this world, it looks like this is not my story. Now, though it has been told as if it is my story, but my experience does not resonate with what has been said. If I am the subject of investigation, minimally first it should be able to give an account of what I do. And it looks like social scientific research have been consistently failing to give a reasonable sense of what I do, how I exist in this world. At that level, social science seem to be having a problem. Just to summarize this there is a lot that has been written about these kind of problems in the world. Just to summarize them, one of the most important issue which is at stake when you look at the social scientific research is this: the very experience as Indians that we have, is sort of not really appropriately accounted for. Sometimes whatever we are is being distorted, very badly represented. So we have irritation with that. So therefore, one of the difficulty is that there is something stake with experience. But one could ask this question: then why is that there is a great difficulty in accounting for experience of one culture? Now, there are a range of issues that emerge the moment you pose this question in this way. The first question is, now when people use the word culture, for example, whenever we talk about it, where we very loosely use the word culture. Now, but most important distinction that we lack in this conversation is to make sense of what really culture means. I follow Professor S. N. Balgangadhara's work. In Balu's research, culture, became a very central issue of inquiry because it has an impact. It has an implication in the way the experiences of the others have been thought of. So one of the ideas that emerges from his research is that when Europeans came and looked at Indian culture, so as the other culture, The problem that I am describing, we are Indian audience, therefore it is more India-centric kind of a conversation. But this is also the problem that Africans have, Latin Americans have, Japanese have. I mean, you go to any number of places, people have this problem. There is one central problem that European culture appears to explain, give an account of experience of other culture where there is an issue. Now, then what is the nature of this problem in theorizing or giving an account of others' experiences? This is the fundamental question. For that, Bal Gangadhara makes this distinction, saying that if you look at the very nature of learning itself, if culture is about, the way in which you go about this world, you learn to live in this world, if that is what, you can broadly classify Western culture and Indian culture as distinct units, and then you can't simply loosely use this word culture for, there is a Bengali culture and Kannada culture. You can't use that loosely. So culture is a much larger unit. And if you look at it, Bal Gangadhara raised this fundamental question that what makes some difference into cultural difference, not biological, social, or psychological difference. And I basically keep this as a backdrop to take a lot of questions and think further, because this is some kind of a ground clearance that I wanted to have, that we have now focusing our conversation to Western culture as opposed to Indian culture. And then let's focus on how these two cultures have looked at the experience. Now, one way to understand this problem is that I would refer to three different people, three significant people who have contributed to making sense of this problem. Now, one of the most important thing that yesterday discussed was Edward Said. In 1978, Edward Said's monumental work, Orientalism, came into being. What did it show? Now, one of the very important things that in the very introductory chapter of the Edward Said itself becomes so evident, that if you look at what West thinks about the other, specifically in the context of the West Asia, Middle East, the question is, if you look at what West narrates about the other, it's a self-description. So if you look at, to simplify this, now the Europeans were the describer once upon a time. They described a culture, and there is a culture that is being described. So there is the describer, description, and the described. There are three categories. So logically, what you expect, let's say I describe, something, let's say a plant, basically you assume that my description is about that plant. But in this case, what Said was pointing out is that it tells you more about the describer. Why did somebody describe it in that way? Now, the same conclusion in a very rudimentary way, but it was raised much before Edward Said was thinking about by Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo sort of raised this question about when Europeans talk about, Eastern culture, specifically Indian culture, you should go and look at the minds of the Europeans. What made them to think in that way was a significant question. Now, Bala Gangadhara in his work independently arrived at the same conclusion, and saying he takes a further step, saying if you look at how India was theorized in social sciences, described, in various records, if you look at this description, the description gives you more thorough knowledge about the Western culture than about Indian culture. Now, this has a great difficulty in making sense of, many people don't understand, because many people raise this question saying, look, British came to India, they spent time in India, they spoke and lived with people in India, and they observed so many things, and they wrote about it. How can you say this tells more about the European people and not about Indian people? They literally saw people. I mean, this is a kind of a puzzle. This is a kind of a problem within the Western framework many people get into. Now, this is a very important departure where, to clarify this and further develop this idea, I think Indian traditions have something very significant to offer. And this is where I wanted to come back to how Indian, specifically Advaita traditions, have looked at the same problem, in terms of methods. Now, if you look at Advaita tradition largely, I mean, all of you are familiar, a lot of you at least, are familiar with the Sarpa Rajanyaya, right? Serpent and the rope. I would not use the snake and the rope because it will mislead. So serpent and the rope is the most appropriate usage. The serpent, sarpa, has a consequence because it has visha, right? So therefore, it is very important to use it appropriately. Now, in this analogy, what happens? Now, there are two scenarios that you create. You're walking on the road at a specific point in time, maybe in the dawn, maybe in the evening or whenever, that you encounter a snake and you see it as a rope. And all of us have experienced. Or you see a rope and experience it as a snake. And you have a bodily reaction, physiological, psychological reaction to it. And a lot has been debated about it, discussed about it within the Advaita Vedanta tradition in a very, very great detail. And I will keep coming back to that in a way. But imagine, for example, for the time being, in order to make the proposition that was developed by initially in a rudimentary way by Sai, then later by Balagangadhara on his own very profound way, if you take it to the root of this adhyasa, that you come and look at, there is a snake and you see it as a rope. And if you start walking close by, you have a consequence. You might get bitten, right? And then you have a rope and you start imagining it as a serpent. It also has a consequence because you're actually looking at something which is not that. This kind of things happen for various reasons. And what are those reasons, etc., is something that today I may not be able to go into the detail. But I will be focusing about this issue as a very significant issue. Imagine, for example, the way Europeans came and looked at India. They wanted to understand India. Whatever may be the motives and purposes that they had, they had to practically deal with Indian people. They had to establish governance, they have to manage them, they have to, make laws, they have to establish governments, trade, so many things. So therefore, it was necessary to understand this. Now, imagine that they saw a rope and they thought it was serpent. Okay. And India was a rope and they imagined it as a serpent. And somebody wrote about it. And everybody was discussing about the serpent. Right? And next 200 years, the discussion went on. They were looking at an object. Aren't they not looking at an object? Of course. I mean, they are not hallucinating. I mean, they certainly are seeing some object. But this object is superimposed by something else. And that's why you are seeing it as a serpent. And there is a description of the serpent that is going on. And this purpose, the colonial administrators, and then you have large number of other people like military people, and then negotiators, and then came ethnographers, then came social scientists, sociology, etc., developed in this period of when colonialism was occurring. And they were all talking about a serpent. And literally in front of them, there was a rope. Now imagine this corpus was developed. And they were very right in terms of using some methods, some techniques, some tools of study, some very deeper reflection, some deep philosophical understanding, everything. But what are they debating? They're not debating the rope, but rather debating the serpent. And if you see that way, now, are they not putting an effort? They're very serious in terms of putting their effort in understanding an object. And this object that they're recognizing is superimposed by something else, either rope as the snake, rope as the serpent, or serpent as the rope. As a consequence, no matter what body of the literature that has been produced around it, it is not about the object, to which that we had to focus upon. Now, if you understand this layout, for example, now it brings us back to some of the fundamental questions. Now, what made them to see it as a serpent is an important question that we must ask. It is not simply some kind of a vision problem or something else. There are a whole range of issues that Advaita Vedanta gives us a very rich understanding, about Gnana, Gnanadhyasa, is one way, Arthadhyasa is another way. And there is a very interesting debate to explore. For example, there are some khatis, there are, which are very important part of understanding. Advaitins, Buddhists and Naiyayikas have debated about some of these tools to actually figure out what exactly is the problem of adhyasa. There are madhyamikas, and then the various Naiyayikas have, there are very famous 5 khatis that you can talk about. Atma khyati, asatya khyati, akhyati, anyatha khyati. Like this, there are different kind of khatis about which they have discarded, they have kept, etc. But this will be very illuminating in figuring out first question: why did Europeans saw our culture? Rope as a serpent. Why did they see this way, not as rope? Why? What was the difficulty for them to see that? Now one has to go into the minds of why did they really see it that way. Now, if that examination is not done, now it is very difficult to understand. Then you have to say these people were engaged in conspiracy, which is not, because you can't say thousands of people collectively decided to do a conspiracy against a culture is a very difficult claim, because we also know that there are fantastic, Europeans who are very sympathetic towards India, etc. were very, very evident in the entire conversation system that was available. This is the first part. And second, what made us, for example, Indians today, see today a large body of social sciences that we have is a consequence of what we do. Okay. Now, one of the very important issue that we must be raising in this conversation is, why did Indian carry this? Okay, fine, somebody came, somebody, one person, X person, 10%, one group of people saw a rope as serpent. But why did others also continue to carry? What made them to see rope as a serpent all the time? This is a question that requires to be thought of. Now, when we have to give this theoretical explanation to this detail, I guess the resources that have been developed within the Advaitic tradition, Vedantic tradition, that are available, some of the methods that they have debated, some of them they have discarded, etc. We have to bring them back to actually make sense of it. Now, why it is important? Because it has a serious consequence on our experiences. That is where we began our story. Now, whenever we hear any descriptions, about Indian society, the major discomfort that emerges in us is because it doesn't match with our experiences. It doesn't give an account of what I am doing, why I am doing. And actually, it transforms us into some kind of, either it becomes an esoteric thing, or it becomes something which is, an individual like me will turn out to be a moron. But instead, how do we really gain access to this experience, and how do we reorient social science towards that? For that, we need frameworks to rethink, the entire social sciences itself. Therefore, this is not the question of one method over the other. In fact, if you're a good natural scientist, the discussion on method is a very futile discussion. Now, you chase a question because fundamentally you wanted to know something in the world. And this knowing, which is something that Indian traditions are the front runners, because they have spent their entire energy on this business of knowing. And for this knowing, you need to require certain tools. And these tools can only be worked out within certain framework. And I think the discussion which ran for at least about 400 years post Shankara on the Adhyasa is a very significant contribution to entire rethinking of the social sciences itself, because the Sarparajju Nyaya, this metaphor would actually give us what made somebody not see rope as rope, not see serpent as serpent, they saw something else. Now, as a consequence, it also gives an account, for example, when we say, when Europeans described India, it doesn't say much about India, but it says more about European culture. Now, this is logically explainable because in Adhyasa, one of the most important issues, that Smriti is a very significant part of it, right? Now, you can't simply think something randomly. One of the most significant player in any kind of reflection that happens within the Maya, in the Adhyasa framework, is the Smriti. So I am visualizing it as a serpent, and the element of serpent and the description that I'm giving has to be there already in me. And I can't see something which is not there in me. I have to really source it to something that exists in me. The question is, if Europeans came and saw this rope that India is as serpent, what was there in their smriti to make them see this as a serpent? Now, this is a very central question that we need to really go and give an account of it, because Maya has a consequence in the world. It has a causal function. It does things. As opposed to Jnana, Maya really has a very powerful causal function. And you need to give an account and characterization of how does this Maya really operate in this way. Now, if we start expanding, see, this is not the job of one person or two person. I think a lot of us had to sit with this, because one of the question is The moment you start taking the social scientific theories, we start undermining our own experiences. Because the theories, the structures that we have around, has nothing to do with the rope, but rather it is about the serpent which doesn't exist there. If that is what is very significant, then we need to shift this focus from the serpent to the rope that India is. And if we have to do that, we have to do a lot of things, because we must know, all of us, whether you are a Sanskrit scholar or not, all of us have carried these stories. The story of the serpent has become the common sense in our world today. Now we have to clean ourselves to get rid of it. Some of them are very good, that they have less influence. Some of them have more. But the question, it is only the degree of difference. But this is something that we have been taught for last 200 years formally through our schooling system. Therefore, one of the very important things that we should spend, actually, I would request Srinivasji, we would join hands with you to really work it out and go back to some of the discussions in the Advaita tradition, go back and re-examine how did the rope that India is became a serpent, and really work it out and bring the methods, because otherwise all those people who recognize us, whether it is Aurobindo or the Said or extraordinary work by my Guru Balagangadhara, all of them get there are development, but we have great difficulty in making people understand why it is not about India, it is about Europe, why it is important to know. In fact, this gives us actually two important entry point. One is to know why did some people saw the rope as serpent, give an account of it, and come back, and how do we actually liberate ourselves from this illusion of the serpent and come back to the rope. And what is interesting is in rope. Lot of things are at stake, because today I am seen as a serpent, not as a rope. I mean, I wanted to see myself as a rope, which that is what my function is about. Once we do that, in order to do that, I think we will be contributing very significantly in developing this debate, which is sort of reached a dead end in the Advaita tradition. We need to actually sort of raise it and take it further. And there are very fascinating, we need to revisit some of the questions that the Buddhists have raised. We have to revisit some of the questions that Nayayikas have raised. And I know there are some deficits. I've been spending last few years time around it. It's very fascinating debate. And they are not just fascinating because they were written by ancestors. They are very fascinating because these are the most powerful tool to make us understand how human beings think about the world. See, at the end of the day, when our ancestors reflected about human beings, they did not, write any treatise for Indians. They wrote it for human beings and the world. Now, we also, a flourishing of the IKS is about, developing structures in such a way that irrespective of people, whether they belong to Indian culture or European culture or any other culture, we should be able to, talk about them in a significantly accurate manner, so that this knowledge is very useful. We can make sense of it. At the end of the day, at least in the Advaita tradition, this Ajnana limits me from Ananda. What is at stake is our happiness. Now, why we have to go back to this framework and spend probably a couple of decades in really working it out. And this is where I see the emergence of the new social sciences. Today, the social sciences are not sciences, but if they have to become sciences, I think the some of our traditional understanding of knowledge and obstacle to knowledge are very important. I have just taken one small fragment. I have not even elaborated the details of what is the nature of the debate which is there within the Sarparaju debate. I mean, this is phenomenally huge. It cannot be addressed in half an hour discussion. But I just wanted to impress upon people in saying that the moment you take this metaphor, Sarparaju, you know what has happened to us. And it makes sense, saying how the European description of India, our social sciences are not about us. It also gives us an account and saying why we are very deeply upset whenever we hear any social scientific research. In fact, many people would want to sort of abandon social sciences. Our task is not to abandon it. We need to build it. We need to build it for the betterment of the people, not just of India, but for the whole world. If at all we wanted to do this, I think there is a framework which is so important. Adhyasa becomes so crucial to rethink about, redevelop this method by working with the contemporary problem. It also addresses some of the questions that yesterday was implicitly there. Sadharanikarana and Yuganukula. I mean, if you take this, it makes it so clear. In fact, you get rid of so many questions which are unnecessary. They're asked in the conferences as the most profound question when they are not. So one would actually, swim in this illusion that you're asking some fascinating, question, but they are very, very trivial questions. So that's why I think we need to go back to this framework, this metaphor, revisit our debate, revisit in a way, take the contemporary problem and start engaging them. We are also testing, the limits. And we must also acknowledge that these debates have stopped, a few centuries before. We need to come back to them. We need to develop them. They have not settled it fully. They were fighting with each other. Now we need to take it for the betterment of humanity. I think I will stop here. I'm sorry, within half an hour, I could not take examples because conceptually presenting itself is a very time consuming. I am also sorry, there are a lot of Sanskrit scholars. I didn't get into the detailed structure of how the Sarparaju is debated within the Sanskrit tradition. I mean, that is something that I would urge the Siddhanta Foundation and others to join hands, and I think we should focus this. This is the only way to build and strengthen social science in the future, and India has a role to play here. Very, very convincing role to play in developing this framework. With that, I will stop here. Leave it to
Wonderful,
Srinivas.
Acharya. Actually, when you took up this adhyasa, so the concept of Brahma itself,
Yeah,
the Mimamsakas not accepting it as a classification of cognition itself. Nayayikas have a different structure to it, different
position.
process
Yeah,
that they.
yeah.
That's a really wonderful topic to actually go. And even thinking about social sciences in the IKS framework itself is a new phenomenon because social sciences or cultural studies are very much it's not known that much. As yesterday, even Paturi's ji also came up with how cultural bias and all that stuff. Because these are things where we have to actually maybe build a parallel our own frameworks based on our shastric methodology and etc. That is really a very fascinating thing to do, and I hope some of the scholars from the participants may get inspired by your talk and at least see that there is a possibility of research in new arenas. And there is one question, I suppose you are also able to see that. It is ironic that as a culture that had pramanas as our base and a climate of katha, that is debate, we lost it. Is it because we did not have access to the original texts, be it bhashya or tika, nor the means to interpret it? I don't know whether
No, I see. I wouldn't take that route because, of course, I know in Indian tradition there were historical reasons. For example, between 10th century to 15th century, 500 years, for many Shastra, it's a dark age. Nobody talks about dark age of, in IKS, right? I mean, almost, for example, Mimamsa stopped at 10th century and it has to wait till 15th century, to come back and, take its position. There were gaps, etc. But it is not the question of inaccessibility to original text. I mean, the access to original text was never a problem. They were always there. Maybe its reachability might have reduced, circulation might have reduced. But interpretation, I know that's a different debate. I will not get into, because whether there is a fundamental question whether Indians, when they wrote Bhashya, whether you can call Bhashya as interpretation. There is a very fundamental question. And there are good reasons to say they are not interpretation. In fact, it is actually a nice thing not to interpret, but rather do something else. So, but I will not get into those details, but I think one of the things that has happened is that the colonialism has damaged in two different ways. One, there are breaks in transmission of knowledge, number one. Number two, now the Sarpa Raju, that's precisely, there were institutional change with British colonialism specifically, is that the rope was read as Sarpa. And the Sarpa has been the story that have been taught to us for the last 200 years. Now, we have never made any intervention in figuring here and there, people identified there is some kind of a development that has happened. So we need to figure out how do we really come back to that. Yeah. So there was a
so
question by Prakash, I think.
yeah. My question is, are Indians now in a situation that Europeans were with respect to the Greco-Roman sources in terms of accessibility of their knowledge traditions like Advaita?
No, I don't think so. Because the tradition in different forms and different shapes are still accessible to Indians, and of course there is The distance between the way the traditions flourished and the way we see them today has increased, and it is increasing day by day. We are losing access day by day, it's true, but we have never lost complete access to the tradition. And there is no complete reconfiguration that has happened in that way, is my personal kind of a reaction to that. But I think this is a question that I also need to think very deeply about it. I will consider this question very seriously for my further inquiry. Thanks, Prakash, for the question.